Good morning, everyone. This is John Denuzzo of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. I'm joined today by Pat Niles. He wears many hats in the history community. He's an Alliance trustee. He's the president of the Washington County Historical Society, co-chair of the Washington County 250 Committee, and also a licensed tour guide at the Saratoga Battlefield. We want to talk today, Pat, about Carleton's raid, on which you are expert. So we're going to devote ourselves this morning and actually next Saturday to the topic of Carleton's raid. When did that happen, Pat, and what were the background of it?
It happened in October of 1780. The American Revolution had really been going on since 75. 77, of course, was the big campaign, the Burgoyne campaign. The British lost, and when they lost their military, basically. They became part of the Convention Army. In 78, when the new governor of Canada came in, Frederick Haldeman, he had to defend Canada. It had been invaded in 1775 by the Americans. There were threats of the Americans doing it again. The French were on the horizon because the Americans become allied with the French in February 1778 as a result of the victory at Saratoga. And so he had to defend it. He didn't have enough men to defend it. What he had left were loyalists, remnants of the Canadian army that had been defeated by Burgoyne. And how is he going to do that? Well, he starts to defend specific spot entry into Canada, but that's a long 5,000 miles to defend, basically. So he goes on the offensive. What does he have? He's got loyalists that are willing to fight. He's got Native Americans that are willing to defend Canada or fight against the rebel army for the most part. And he's got professional soldiers such as Christopher Carleton. Christopher Carleton was a major in the 29th Regiment. He had been raised by his uncle Guy Carleton, who had been the commander of Canada, and he had also been the governor of Canada and spent a lot of his time in Canada. Christopher's parents had died early. They come to Guy, who raises them. Christopher ends up becoming enamored with William Johnson, and Johnson became somewhat of a model for him. And one of the things Johnson did was he lived with the Native Americans and took a Native American wife. Carleton does the same thing. So as a result of that, he was becoming more Native American than he was English and a soldier. He had been put into the army at the age of about 12. The uncles decided to send him back to England where he got an education, and he came over in 1776 with the reinforcements that drove the Americans out of Canada at that time. Now, he was an expert. He was a professional soldier who could handle professionals, but he could also handle Native Americans and handled them well, where at the beginning of this campaign in 78, 79, these raids into New York, some of the loyalists could not handle, and he was a perfect candidate to do that. He could do it. John Johnson, son of William Johnson, was very good at it as well, and there are a few others. And so Haldeman starts to send these people in to just shock the Americans. The idea is to push the border back as far as you possibly can. South, exactly. Get it away from the Canadian border. Reading the documents, the Haldeman papers, is what I use to research this. You end up seeing that Haldeman, he is scared to death that the French, they're going to come in again. He's afraid that the Americans are going to raid up the Champlain Valley again, or possibly from New Hampshire into Canada up in that area. So those areas are under a lot of pressure throughout. Now, one of the things that they have, and I've said that already, is they have the loyalists. A lot of the loyalists, after the Burgoyne campaign, end up wanting to leave, and they couldn't get out. They had escaped a few nights before the surrender of Burgoyne in 77. A lot of them went back home, believe it or not. Some went to Canada. And what they find out is they're being persecuted. They were persecuted before the Burgoyne campaign. They're persecuted after the Burgoyne campaign. One of the things that these small scouting parties do is they pick up these loyalists and they bring them back to Canada. They try to get them into their different units that they are trying to put together. So it's a constant scouting. And these scouts pick up information on their scout through a particular area, but they also bring back people that have been living there and understand what's going on with the government. They understand what the military is doing at that particular point in time. And these raids, there were raids before, or not raids, but scouts before. The raids are always set up. And the Carleton raid in 1780 was the result of the Clinton-Sullivan campaign in 79. If you know anything about the Clinton-Sullivan campaign, Clinton and Sullivan American commanders went across and destroyed the Iroquois nation as much as they possibly could, except the Tuscarora and the Oneida. And what that did was that starved them out, basically forced them for the British to feed them. It forced the Iroquois nation, a lot of them, to go up into Canada at that time. Now, one of his allies are the Iroquois. Haldeman. Got to keep the Iroquois. And so the 1780 raid, the Carleton raid, went all the way across upstate New York. Johnson came down through the Great Lakes and came across the Mohawk Valley and devastated that. Carleton ended up going into Charlotte County at that time, but Essex, Washington, Warren County, almost into Saratoga County. We had the Royalton raid over into Vermont, which was a raid that was just thrown together. So this is a massive raid. It was meant to push the border back, but it was also meant to confuse the military commanders at that time.
Where did Carleton go after he came south on Lake Champlain? Where did he go, and what did he abuse?
No. Carleton ended up coming down to the South Bay and cut across land to Fort Anne, which was his first objective. After Fort Anne, he ends up going south on the military road and sent out burning parties on both sides of the road all the way through Kingston, and then bypassed Fort Edward and went into what would now be Glens Falls. It was Wings Falls at that time, and stayed there for the night, sent out burning parties that went all the way down to Schuylerville. At that time was Saratoga.
Are there things that people can see, landmarks, for example, you can tell us that he abused and burned and harmed people?
Well, we know that he burned Fort Anne. There wasn't a lot in Fort Anne anyways. Fort Anne was really basically a stop for the most part, because they would go up Halfway Brook, they would go to Wood Creek, and they would go up to Champlain, up to what was Skeensboro. But the real burning, you could go to Fort Anne. You can go down the military road into Fort Edward. You can see...
That's Route 4?
That's
correct?
Route 4, thank you. You can cut lots and go into Glens Falls. You can see Cooper's Cave. That's where Wings Falls was at that point. They stayed there overnight. You can run down on the west side if you continue into Fort Edward. Not that he did. He bypassed it because he said there wasn't enough there to burn. He didn't want to waste his time. It would create too much of an alarm. So he ended up bypassing Fort Edward. On the west side, his burning parties came down. So that whole side in what is now Gansford, just outside of Fort Edward, you go down the River Road on that far side, there was nothing left when he got down through that area. James Rogers, which was Robert Rogers' brother, created a loyalist group up in Canada. He went as far, or tried to get into Schuylerville, but there was just too much military traffic right there. Of course, Carleton came to the southern end of West-South Bay.
Of Lake George.
Of Lake
Champlain.
Champlain. He describes it as 18 miles, the toughest land that he'd ever been through at that time. His first area that he runs across is the sawmill that Skeen had put together with a blockhouse. And so that was deserted at that point. He left people there to burn. He gets to Fort Anne early in the morning. The Americans know they're coming, but they don't have a whole lot there. They have a fort in Fort Anne. It was basically a picketed fort around the Cheshire House, and Cheshire was a caretaker for Philip Skeen. And he's got about 50, 60 levies, and a levy is a hired state soldier. These are the guys that are too old to fight, or these are young guys that didn't go into the Continental Army, and so they're not great soldiers. They're there to defend. Well, Carleton basically sends in 2 officers. The 2 officers give them terms of surrender. They take it. British burn whatever's there. They burn the fort, the Cheshire House, and then they start their movement down the road. They burn every single house that is non-loyalist. They target who they're going to attack. This is as much of civil war as it is British against the Patriots. There aren't a whole lot of Patriot soldiers up here. They've all moved south. The war has moved south. So what are you defending with? You're defending with militia, you're defending with levies and a few Continentals at that point. So they burn out all the Patriot homes. It was revenge. And they would destroy the crops. They would butcher all the cattle as much as they possibly could. In some cases, I read they would leave, if it was a family, they would leave 1 milk cow to take care of the kids. That was it.
So this is like 3 years after the Burgoyne defeat at Saratoga,
Right.
the turning point, as it's been called since then. But it's the outcome is not determined yet. I mean, basically, the Americans and British continue to battle, as you said, further south. Now, you mentioned Fort Anne was destroyed, Kingsbury. So what was the path from Kingsbury, let's say?
Went down the military road, and they...
Which is Route 4?
Route 4. They cut cross lots, basically. They come across what would be Route 254, and they end up coming down, ending up moving into the Glens Falls area. The Raiders were not there to kill as many as they possibly could. They wanted them out, burning them out, taking away their farms, taking away their cattle. That type of thing was a way to get rid of them, get them off here. I'm sure there was some killing. There was no doubt about it. But that wasn't the major objective. It's get them out of here.
Wrapping up this segment, is there a book you'd recommend to learn more about the topic?
Gavin Watts, Canadian historian that wrote specifically on the Loyalist perspective. Ted Corbett's book on the turning point. It's called No Turning Point. It came out in 2012 and talks about the Washington County area and how basically Burgoyne's campaign didn't end it, and this is one of the chapters in it, but there's no book on it per se.
And one other thing I think should be mentioned, you did a lot of research on the Carleton's raid, and you took the initiative to get a series of historical markers placed throughout the region. We'll be talking about Fort George in another segment, but
Right.
Other than Lake George, where else are these markers that people can see?
We have one in Fort Anne. The other one that I got up was in Whitehall. The British and the Americans used to meet at Skeensboro for exchange of prisoners. The marker that I put in was over exchange of prisoners.
Well, thanks very much, Pat. It's been very important, I think, to the story of the whole region, and certainly having you on has helped us. For more information, people can go to LakeGeorgeBattlefieldPark.org and find a whole host of further information on this.